Take my bride, let's go for a ride in my newfangled automobile. Just where we will go, nobody knows, but it's sure a great way to feel. Behind the wheel of the speed meter steel, it's my newfangled automobile.
Hello and welcome to Vintage Car History. I'm Wild Bill. We Americans like to see our country as being the first, biggest, and best at most things. This includes the early automotive industry. It's not common for American classic car enthusiasts to be well versed in European automotive history, and folks on the street just assume that Henry Ford invented the car. Yet the truth is that the USA came to the automotive industry quite late and had to work hard to catch up on the far more technologically advanced, larger, and more productive automakers of Europe. So, why was America so slow to embrace cars? There's quite a few reasons. The first, and perhaps the most obvious reason, was the road situation. Europe has had paved roads crisscrossing it for some 2,000 years. In the early 19th century, steam locomotives and coaches were invented in England and spread quickly across Europe. By the mid-1800s, steam-powered road vehicles, railroads, and steamships were all vying for transportation dominance. So when true cars appeared there in the early 1880s, there was already the road infrastructure in place to support them. Indeed, in 1900, you can buy and drive a car from Paris to Berlin to Vienna to Rome, all on paved roads. The United States had no such development. The first paved highway in the country was completed in 1795, connecting the then capital of the United States, Philadelphia, with the capital of Pennsylvania, which at the time was Lancaster. A total of 62 miles, as opposed to the over 40,000 miles across the pond. Roads cost money to make, and the fledgling USA did not have very much of that. They also take manpower to build, something else the nation did not have in abundance. The 19th century saw the U.S. expand westward towards the Pacific, and as it did so, the population became more sparse. Even with immigration being encouraged from just about anywhere, the inflow of people couldn't fill the vast land and work it. Rivers and other natural waterways were certainly helpful in the push west. Thus, in 1811, President James Madison authorized the construction of the National Road, often called the Cumberland Turnpike today. The purpose of this road was to connect the Ohio and Potomac rivers to facilitate both migration and cargo transport east and west. By 1837, the road itself was some 620 miles long and terminated at the then capital of Illinois, Vandalia. Yet the locomotives came to America about this time, and it seemed to make a whole lot more sense in the American situation than making roads. Traveling on a road happens at a pedestrian pace, be you human, horse, or otherwise. Due to this, facilities along the road to water, feed, and rest the people and animals involved need to be in place along the route at fairly regular intervals. And of course, the road must be paid for, materials and labor, before it even has a chance through tolls of making any money back. The railroad addressed all of these issues. It was orders of magnitude faster than horses over long distances. The locomotive itself does need to be fueled, watered, and maintained regularly, but this can be done far less frequently along the route. And with the population spread so thin across most of the country, this meant it took a fraction of the people to maintain a railroad as opposed to a road. And of course, the railroad must be paid for, as well as the locomotives and rail cars that it pulls. The federal government did not have the money to build either roads or railroads, but it did have access to a lot of land. The U.S. could, in theory, sell or lease land to the private sector and let local businesses build the railroads and trains. That way, the government makes money and someone else does the work. Win-win. And that's pretty much what happened for the rest of the 19th century. New railroad companies formed, bought land, and started to build. Of course, the government found even more ways to make money in the process, as did the railroad tycoons. By 1900, the USA boasted the biggest railroad network in the world, and the nation itself had molded their landscape and lifestyles to accommodate it. The cities and towns of America had streets with broad sidewalks, with the center of the road used only for horse-drawn vehicles. People didn't typically ride their horse into town, but rather tied it up or stabled the horse on the outskirts and walked from there. And for all but the largest of U.S. cities, the center of the road was fairly narrow as the amount of horse-drawn traffic was much lower than foot traffic. The sidewalks were, of course, paved and well-groomed. The center of the road, however, was another story. There were those major U.S. cities that had the center paved with stone, brick, cement, asphalt, or other such, but that was not widespread. Most towns and small cities did not pave the center of the road at all. It was either clay or mud, depending on the weather. This was not an issue, since that part is for horses and wagons anyway, and they don't care. And of course, horseshoe nails riddled the streets of America. Thus, by 1900, Americans that lived in rural America and needed to get somewhere either walked or rode into town, boarded the train to wherever they're going, and once there, walked or rented a ride to their final destination. The railroads removed the need to connect the nation with roads, so the U.S. didn't bother doing it. What roads that were built connected locations too remote or difficult to reach by rail. Now, another factor in the USA's slow acceptance of cars was the railroad companies themselves. Over the 19th century, the tycoons not only built the railroads and trains, but also a cultural and federal dependence on them. Trains moved the people and products of America, and railways worked hard to keep it that way. They did this in two primary ways, politically and through propaganda. On the political side, they had a strong lobby in the Capitol and many friends in the government at all levels. The railroad itself was, and still is, an important part of national defense. If war comes to the continent, the ability to move troops and supplies quickly to anywhere in the country would be critical in deterring any foreign adversary from attempting an invasion of the states. For any business, being a keystone in a country's defense strategy is a prestigious position to be in. And the railroads, of course, exploited this in Congress as much as possible. Land grants were issued as opposed to having to buy or lease the property for critical connections in the defense grid. Tax breaks were given and local governments offered incentives to the railroads to connect their towns to the trains. Thus, the railroads were amongst the wealthiest and most powerful industries politically in America and were used to getting what they wanted from the politicians. And they did not want roads. Even before the car's invention, they were against it for one simple reason. The more roads there were, the more people could avoid taking a train. So whenever someone in Congress got the idea to build a road, the train tycoons were all over it, promising to make the connection and be faster and more convenient than any man or horse could manage and make the country safe from invasion. The stranglehold the railroads had on the U.S. government was tight. It was through propaganda that the railroads kept the same grip on the population. Getting companies and the government to use the train for logistics was not particularly hard to do, but getting paid passengers was another matter. When locomotives first were introduced to the American public in the 1820s, they were skeptical at best. True, some of the more nerdy folks were interested in the technology behind them, but John Q. Public was not impressed. Locomotives were still very new, and being unlike anything ever seen before, folks were not quick to trust trains. So the railroads put on public demonstrations and published papers extolling the benefits and luxury that could be found in traveling by train. It took time, but by the 1850s, the locomotives themselves were truly reliable, powerful, and fast enough to make passengers comfortable on their journey. Commuter trains offered services for short trips, including plush seating and restroom facilities. Trains for longer journeys would have baggage cars, sleeping cars, dining cars, kitchens, all the luxuries of home during your travels. The railroads vigorously advertised the safety, ease, and comfort of traveling by train so effectively that by the turn of the 20th century, trains were as American in the public eye as baseball. Whatever gripes about them that some folks may have had did not change the fact that they were absolutely ingrained into American thought. Which brings up yet another issue in America's slow automotive growth: public opinion. When cars first began to appear in the U.S. in the mid-1890s, the railroads published articles and had artists and illustrators depict in paintings and cartoons the dangers of the automobile, and most people believed it. Town meetings were held across the country to discuss what to do about this new automotive menace. After all, the only places in the country to drive them were on city streets. There weren't many roads anywhere else, and they had to drive in the narrow center part with the horses, which were spooked and caused problems for the wagon driver and nearby pedestrians. Additionally, mechanical failures were common, and the cars with pneumatic tires would bog down in the mud, get their tires punctured because of all the nails, and be stuck, causing an obstruction. Now, it's gonna take a crowd to pull the thing out, and of course it's a machine no one's seen before, so the crowd gathers and starts to marvel, gawk, or ridicule. The police arrive to disperse the crowd, and the car driver is cited for disturbing the peace. As scenes like this began to happen in the U.S., the railroads helped spread the word about them to other towns by insisting the newspapers write about the incidents as negatively as possible. By 1900, hundreds of towns across America banned cars from their streets entirely, and one, Mackinac Island off the north coast of Michigan, still does to this day. The public at large did not want cars. The lack of enthusiasm from Americans about automobiles, combined with the lack of places to drive them, severely hampered the early U.S. automakers, while the European ones were, for the most part, not so hindered. This slowed the pace of automotive development in the U.S. technologically. Let's compare two cars that demonstrate this quite well. First, we'll look at the 1901 Mercedes 35 horsepower. This car was designed to be a high-end touring car, though many owners took them to the track anyway and won races like crazy. Straight 4 6-liter engine of 35 horsepower, 4-speed transmission, low to the ground and lightweight. It is widely considered to be the world's first truly modern car. It was fast, quick, and nimble, perfect for driving the country roads of Germany, France, Italy, or wherever suits your fancy. To compare this with an American car, we'll need to set some criteria since touring cars were not built in the U.S. at the time. First, it has to be a car meant to be driven on a road and not one designed for cart paths and open fields. Second, it must be gas-powered, and third, should be on the high end of American automotive offerings. So let's take a look at this one, a 1901 Winton Runabout. Sporting a single-cylinder engine putting out about 8 horses, it also has a 2-speed constant mesh transmission, which requires 2 clutches to operate. The suspension and bodywork are very high-centered and more carriage than car-like. The technology used in this car is not that far removed from Daimler's original work, while the Mercedes is at least 2 generations of car technology past it. Now, the U.S. auto industry did catch on, and by 1910 was pretty much equal to the European car makers. Yet with all of this opposition, how did America get rolling? Well, the car had some powerful allies in America, and this channel is already full of their stories and exploits. Engineers, publishers, lobbyists, and other automotive enthusiasts did help pave the way. Yet, was there a seminal event in American history that was truly the catalyst in getting America into gear? Allow me to present my own opinion for discussion. If a single event can be named that caused the USA to gearhead eyes, it was, in my opinion, the Spanish-American War of 1898. For the latter half of the 19th century, U.S. foreign policy had been very isolationist, and for good reason. Americans were too busy trying to tame their massive landscape to get involved in wars overseas. Yet they had learned lessons from the War of 1812, and so fortified the East Coast with various land defenses, forts, and garrisons throughout the rest of the century. By 1900, invading the U.S. by sea from Europe was widely thought impossible by American military analysts of the time. However, as a result of this war, the USA was now a significant power with an overseas empire of her own to both rule and protect. Now possessing lands in the Caribbean and across the Pacific, it was more likely diplomatic problems would occur, and the idea of actually going to war and invading a European power, and conversely them invading the USA, had to be considered. And so the big brass of the Army and Navy began to wargame the possibilities and submit them to various congressional committees. Now, it's no secret that starving an enemy army is the cheapest way to defeat it, and to do that you must destroy the supply lines supporting it. And to that end, no matter who is invading who, the first thing you would do is disrupt the railroads as fast as possible. The Yankees learned this during the war between the states, that if they tore up the South's rails, they couldn't move supplies or troops until a specialized crew came out with specialized equipment to repair the line. And in a time of war, you don't always have that on hand. But by 1900, things were different. Europe also had railroads to disrupt, but they also had an equally impressive paved road network and cars that could drive on them at speeds comparable to a locomotive. And they had lots of cars. So if the USA invaded Europe and disrupted their railways, the enemy can still resupply and quickly move troops with the roads and cars, something rather famously demonstrated by the French in 1914. And if the road was damaged, just have the troops grab some shovels, fill it in, tamp it down, and keep driving. No special teams needed to make a temporary road repair. The overall conclusion at the time was simple. The USA is in fact vulnerable to attack due to a lack of roads and cars, and Europe knew it. Their generals had been doing the same kind of war games as well, and realized that if the U.S. railway network was disrupted, the country would be paralyzed. Whether or not the American mainland would actually be attacked was another matter, but the U.S. had an empire to protect, yet really couldn't effectively protect its own east coast. What would stop someone from starting a war or extreme political stress to force the U.S. to give up its new territories? The only way to stop that scenario from happening was to build roads and cars, and the military was filling the ears of the politicians with this opinion, despite the railroads' protests. America has been building roads for military reasons ever since, most famously the interstate highway system during the Eisenhower administration. And the U.S. government began to buy cars for military testing in the first decade of the 20th century, as well as for various civil service purposes. America would eventually become the biggest car maker in the world, yet it appears that the U.S. got there despite it kicking and screaming the whole way. America didn't want cars at first, but once they did, the rest became history. Thanks for watching Vintage Car History, and we'll see you next week. Peace.